Whitlock Farm's been dead 18 years, Renata. 65 acres of nothing but weeds and ruin. That's what the county clerk told her twice while processing the paperwork, as if repeating it might actually make her change her mind before the ink dried. It didn't. Have you ever looked at something everyone else had already given up on and felt something in you say yes anyway? Stay with me, because what this land was hiding underneath all that brush is going to surprise you. And if stories like this keep you watching until the very end, drop a comment and let me know, because I want to see how many of you saw this coming. In the spring of 2025, a 36-year-old former catering company operations manager named Renata Cruz bought 65 acres of neglected farmland on the edge of Somerset County, Kentucky, for a price so low the county clerk asked her twice if she'd read the listing correctly. The property came with a leaning barn, a rusted farmall tractor that hadn't turned over in years, a greenhouse with more broken glass than whole, and pastures so overgrown with brush and volunteer trees that the fence lines had disappeared entirely under a decade of neglect. Everyone who heard about the purchase told her the same thing in one form or another. It was too much land for one person. It was too far gone to bring back without money she clearly didn't have. She'd spend a year of savings just clearing brush before she ever got a single row planted. Renata had heard versions of that speech her whole adult life, mostly from people who meant well and had never once tried to build something themselves. She'd spent 11 years managing catering operations in Louisville, watching good kitchens live or die on the reliability of their produce suppliers. And somewhere in the last few of those years, tired of paying premium prices for vegetables trucked in from 3 states away, she'd started dreaming about growing the food herself instead of just plating it. The farm she bought was belonged to a man named Hollis Whitlock, who'd worked it for close to 45 years before arthritis and age finally caught up with him in his late 80s. His children, none of whom had any interest in farming, sold off the land in pieces after he passed, and the last 65 acres, the least accessible and most overgrown stretch, sat on the market for the better part of 2 years before Renata made an offer nobody else had been willing to make. The first week on the property taught her more than any of the farming books she'd been reading for the past year. The pastures, left unmanaged for over a decade, had gone from open grassland to a tangle of multiflora rose, autumn olive, and volunteer cedar saplings thick enough in places that she couldn't see more than 20 feet in any direction. The greenhouse frame was salvageable, but every pane of glass would need replacing, and half the irrigation lines running through it had cracked from years of freeze and thaw. The barn leaned noticeably to the east, a problem her contractor told her plainly would need addressing before she stored anything valuable inside it. And the tractor, the old farmhaul that had come with the property, sat exactly where Hollis Whitlock had apparently parked it the last time, tires flat, engine seized, mice nesting in what remained of the seat cushion. A neighbor who stopped by that first week, a cattle rancher named Grady Pruitt, who'd farmed the adjoining property for 25 years, took one look at the tractor and told Renata, without much diplomacy, that she'd have been better off buying a working machine outright than trying to save one that far gone. Renata thanked him for the opinion and kept working anyway. Here's the thing most people driving past that fence line never stop to ask. What if the land wasn't actually dead? What if it was just waiting for someone patient enough to listen to it instead of writing it off? Keep watching, because in a few months, this same land is going to do something nobody in that county expected, least of all the man who just told her to give up. She'd decided in the months before closing on the property that she wasn't going to farm the way Hollis Whitlock had farmed it, or the way most of her new neighbors farmed their own land. She'd spent that final year in Louisville reading everything she could find about regenerative agriculture, about cover cropping and rotational grazing, and building soil health from the ground up rather than relying on the same inputs her neighbors had been using for decades. It was a philosophy that had been gaining ground steadily among smaller operations across the region, farmers looking for a way to cut input costs and build resilience into land that had been squeezed hard by rising prices for fertilizer, fuel, and everything else that went into conventional row crop farming. Renata didn't have the capital to farm the conventional way, even if she'd wanted to. What she had was time, stubbornness, and a genuine belief that the land under all that brush was better than anyone driving past it currently assumed. Grady Pruitt's skepticism turned out to be fairly representative of how the rest of the township felt about the whole project. At the feed store in town, word got around quickly that the Whitlock place had sold to a woman who used to manage catering kitchens and never farmed a day in her life. The general assessment, repeated at the diner counter and after church on Sundays, was that she'd burn through her savings within a year, and the land would be back on the market by the following spring, this time at an even lower price than she'd paid for it. Renata spent that first summer doing the unglamorous work nobody wanted to romanticize. She cleared brush by hand and with a rented brush hog, working section by section across pastures that had been abandoned so long the soil underneath had compacted into something close to concrete in places where cattle had once concentrated near old feeding areas. She replaced glass panes in the greenhouse one at a time, ordering them in bulk from a salvage supplier 2 counties over to keep costs manageable, and rebuilt the cracked irrigation lines herself after watching enough instructional videos to feel confident enough to try. The tractor took longer than anything else. Renata had no real mechanical background, but a retired diesel mechanic named Otis Byrne, who ran a small independent repair shop just outside town, took an interest in the project after Renata brought him photos of the seized engine and asked what it would cost to get it running again. Otis quoted her a price for the labor if she brought the tractor to him, but he also mentioned, almost as an aside, that if she wanted to learn the work herself instead of just paying for it, he'd be willing to walk her through it on weekends for considerably less. Renata took him up on the offer, and the two of them spent most of that July and August working through the engine together in Otis's shop, Renata learning to free a seized piston, clean a fuel system, and rebuild a carburetor with her own hands under Otis's patient direction. By September, the old farm all started on the second try, and Renata drove it back to the farm herself, engine running rough but steady, past Grady Pruitt's property line at a speed slow enough that he came out to his fence to watch it pass. If you're still with me at this point, that tells me something. It tells me you're the kind of person who doesn't give up on things just because everyone else already has. So stick around, because what Renata found buried in that lower pasture a few months later is the real reason this story is worth your time tonight. The greenhouse came back into working order that same fall, and Renata used it to start her first serious planting the following spring, a diversified mix of vegetables aimed less at wholesale markets and more at the handful of farm-to-table restaurants in Louisville she still had relationships with from her old career. It was, in its way, the piece of the plan that made the most sense to anyone who bothered to actually ask her about it instead of just repeating gossip from the feed store. She knew exactly which chefs needed exactly which vegetables at exactly which times of year because she'd spent over a decade on the other side of that relationship, placing the same orders herself. Think about that for a second. Everyone assumed her city background was the one thing working against her out here. It turned out to be the one thing nobody else in that county had. The pasture work took a different shape entirely, guided heavily by a rotational grazing consultant Renata hired for a single visit that spring, a woman named Bethany Cole, who worked with the state's conservation district helping smaller operations transition toward regenerative practices. Bethany walked the cleared pastures with Renata, evaluating soil compaction, existing forage species, and water access, and helped her design a simple rotational system using portable electric fencing to move a small starter herd of a dozen beef cattle through the property in tight, frequently moved paddocks, mimicking the way wild grazing animals had once moved across the landscape in dense herds before moving on, rather than letting cattle sit in one place and overgraze it the way conventional continuous grazing tended to. The system asked more of Renata's time than a conventional setup would have, moving fence nearly every day during the growing season. But it asked almost nothing in the way of purchased inputs. And by the end of that first full grazing season, Bethany's soil tests showed organic matter levels climbing in pastures that had been compacted and depleted for years under Hollis Whitlock's later, less attentive management. It was slow, unglamorous progress, the kind that didn't show up as a dramatic before and after photo, but it was progress the soil itself could measure, even when the neighbors driving past on the county road couldn't see it. Here's where it gets interesting. And I need you to really pay attention to this next part, because this is the moment that changed everything for Renata. And honestly, it might be the most important thing you take away from this whole story. The discovery that changed how the rest of the county talked about the Whitlock place happened almost by accident in the middle of that first grazing season, when Renata noticed an unusually green, lush patch of vegetation persisting in one corner of the lower pasture through a stretch of dry July weather that had turned the rest of the property noticeably brown. Curious, she walked out to the spot and found, half buried under decades of accumulated leaf litter and brush, a spring box, an old concrete structure built to capture and channel groundwater, capped and apparently abandoned sometime in the decades before Hollis Whitlock's own tenure on the land, based on how thoroughly it had been swallowed by undergrowth. She mentioned the find to Grady Pruitt of all people, mostly because he was the neighbor she happened to run into most often at the mailbox, and Grady, despite his ongoing skepticism about the rest of her operation, took a genuine interest in this particular discovery. He walked out to see it himself and told her, after studying the old concrete work, that spring boxes like that one had been fairly common on farms in the area a century earlier, before most operations switched over to drilled wells, and that a functioning spring capturing groundwater at that volume in a county that had been dealing with tightening water tables and increasingly unpredictable rainfall over the past dry summers was worth considerably more than most people driving past would ever guess. Renata spent 2 weekends that August clearing the spring box out properly, replacing a cracked section of the original concrete collection basin and running a simple gravity-fed line down to a new stock tank in the lower pasture, giving her cattle a reliable water source that didn't depend on the county's increasingly strained municipal supply the way several neighboring operations had started to during the driest stretches of recent summers. It solved almost incidentally one of the more persistent worries she'd been carrying since buying the property, in a county where hay and water costs had both climbed steadily as drought conditions squeezed pasture-based operations across the wider region. Word about the spring spread through the township considerably faster than word about her rotational grazing system ever had, in part because water scarcity was a concern every farmer in the area understood viscerally, regardless of how they felt about newer soil health philosophies. Grady Pruitt, who'd been hauling water to a stock tank on his own property for 2 summers running during the worst of the dry stretches, asked Renata with none of his earlier skepticism whether she thought there might be a similar spring somewhere on his own land that decades of drainage tiling had simply buried and forgotten. The two of them spent an afternoon that September walking his property with an old aerial survey map Grady had inherited from his father, and found, sure enough, evidence of what had likely once been a second spring near his property's northern boundary, capped sometime in the 1960s when tile drainage had come into fashion and low-lying wet spots were treated as problems to be eliminated rather than resources to be managed. By the time the 1-year anniversary of Renata's purchase came around the following spring, the general conversation about the Whitlock place had shifted considerably from what it had been the previous year. The greenhouse was running at full capacity, supplying 3 restaurants in Louisville with a rotating selection of vegetables through most of the growing season. The pastures, though still visibly recovering, were noticeably greener and more productive than they'd been under Hollis Whitlock's final exhausted years of management, supporting a herd that had grown from 12 cattle to 20 without any additional purchased feed. The old farm all ran reliably enough that Renata used it for most of her routine field work, a small point of pride she mentioned more than once to Otis Byrne when he stopped by to check on how his old student's engine work was holding up. And the spring, once cleared and put back into service, had become something of a local curiosity in its own right, prompting at least 2 other farmers in the township beyond Grady to start looking more seriously at their own property's old drainage history, wondering how many other buried water sources might be sitting forgotten under land that modern farming practices had simply written off decades earlier. Grady Pruitt, asked about it at the feed store by someone who remembered his original assessment of the operation, admitted plainly that he'd been wrong about most of what he'd predicted a year earlier. He'd expected the farm to fail from overreach, a woman with no farming background trying to do too much too fast on land too far gone to save. What he'd watched instead was a slower, more deliberate kind of success than he was used to seeing, one built less on any single dramatic decision and more on a year of unglamorous, patient work that had cumulatively turned 65 acres nobody wanted into an operation that was, by any reasonable measure, thriving. Renata never framed the first year as any kind of triumph over her doubters when people asked her about it. She talked instead about soil, organic matter, and rotational timing, and the particular satisfaction of watching a restaurant she used to manage plate a salad grown from seed she'd started in a greenhouse she'd rebuilt with her own hands. But underneath the practical language was the same stubborn instinct that had made her walk away from a stable catering career in the first place, a belief that 65 acres of neglected, overgrown ground still had something valuable buried in it, waiting for someone patient enough to clear away what didn't belong and find out what did. The greenhouse windows caught the morning light now, the way Hollis Whitlock had probably once watched them catch it decades earlier, before age and arthritis made the work too much for him to keep up with. The old tractor started every morning on the first try, and somewhere in the lower pasture, water that had been buried and forgotten for the better part of a century kept running steady into a stock tank that hadn't gone dry once, not even during the driest stretch of a summer that had left half the county hauling water to keep their own herds alive. So, if this story made you believe, even a little, that overlooked things, land, people, second chances, are usually worth a closer look before anyone writes them off, that's exactly the kind of story I want to keep telling. Tell me in the comments, have you ever bet on something everyone else had already given up on? And if you want to see what Renata restores next on the Whitlock place, and whether Grady Pruitt ever finds his own buried spring, subscribe and stick around, because this is only the first year of what's shaping up to be a much longer story.